Hey everyone! If you enjoyed this video, the full version is available on Patreon. I'll be uploading all my content there going forward.
Chapter 1. Brooklyn, 1943. A thick haze enveloped every corner of the city, with the occasional sharp air raid siren piercing the dark sky. At this time, the world was locked in a fierce battle between the Axis powers, led by the Third Reich, and the Allied powers against fascism. Radio and newspapers were filled with news every day about war casualties and the international situation. From Europe to Asia, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. War is everywhere, and smoke is everywhere. No one knows whether hope or destruction will come first. In Luke's words, this is all absolutely terrible. If only I could travel back in time a few decades. I could write a few screenplays in Hollywood, direct a few movies, win a few Oscars, or at the very least, achieve financial freedom by plagiarizing bestsellers and enjoy the decadent lifestyle of capitalism. Located on a street corner, in an empty tavern. Luke held his head in his hands, put his legs on the table, and sighed regretfully. Or, to put it another way, give me a normal world. The American economy was booming after World War II. If you seized the opportunity, making your first fortune wouldn't be too difficult. But, what's with showing up on a Marvel set? Luke sighed as he unfolded today's newspaper. The most prominent headline was about President Roosevelt and Churchill, and Stalin holding a meeting in Tehran. The Allied powers decided to open a second front in Europe in order to defeat the Nazis as soon as possible. However, what attracted his attention was not the course of the World War, but rather the gossip lurking in the corner. Howard Stark and Hollywood's goddess of love, Rita Hayworth, were photographed entering and leaving the Waldorf Astoria Hotel together. A fairly clear black and white photograph is also included below. Stark Industries. Luke, who was only 20 years old, had a bitter smile on his lips. Perhaps in other people's eyes, Howard Stark is just a wealthy and intelligent arms tycoon. But for Luke, the other party had another important identity. The future Iron Man, Tony Stark's father. It was Howard Stark's presence that confirmed Luke's suspicions that he had indeed ended up on the Marvel set. And it was the beginning of everything. The starting point of the timeline before all major events occur. This is both good news and bad news. The good news is that Luke may die before he sees Thanos, the head of the Cosmic Family Planning Commission, snap his fingers. The bad news is, he can't even find the rookie village chief Coulson, or go to Queens to find Spider-Man. Not to mention the Avengers that followed, now even Nick Fury is nowhere to be found, making it completely impossible for Luke's strategy guides, fanfiction, from his previous life to be of any use. Normally, one shouldn't be living in Hell's Kitchen and then being recruited by SHIELD. Will you end up meeting a middle-aged agent with a receding hairline, or encountering a baby Spider-Man, and gain experience by joining his group along the way? If you're lucky, you might even have a cheat code, and maybe even a Black Widow will come knocking and use her seduction skills. I'm clearly the luckiest person here. Luke never imagined that his story would begin in the United States during World War II. And, inexplicably, he became a spirited young man on the streets of Brooklyn. Just thinking about it gives me a headache. Luke covered his face with a newspaper to relieve his depressed mood. He has been in this world for almost 5 or 6 years and has long since accepted his new identity as Luke Cavill. She also accepted that her family were Irish immigrants. Her father died in a gang killing, her mother died of tuberculosis, and she was an orphan without a sister. Now, the only person Luke can call family is his uncle who used to paint houses for people when he was young. Paint the house. This is slang. Luke's uncle was not a house painter. This phrase is used to refer to murder. Because it's difficult to avoid splattering blood on the walls when dealing with certain troubles, gangsters often use painting houses to describe doing dirty work. Luke's uncle was one of those guys who did the dirty work for the gang when he was younger. He was a retired soldier who later started painting houses for gangs to support his family. Because of his decisiveness and cleanliness in handling matters, he never left any unnecessary clues and was always highly appreciated by his superiors. During the years after his parents' death, Luke was able to avoid starvation thanks to his uncle's support. My cheat code that hasn't arrived in so long. Thinking of the cheat codes that every time-traveling predecessor had, Luke felt a pang of sympathy. First, the reason he traveled through time was. It's for a ridiculous reason. Pay-to-win games. That's right, back then, Luke was obsessed with a fighting game that used superheroes as its selling point. They spend money recklessly, attempting to change their unlucky fate through this simple and brutal method. One afternoon, he couldn't resist and impulsively bought the game's deluxe gift pack, which included an SSS-level card, Superman, and multiple templates for the Child of Krypton. It offers excellent value for money. But the moment Luke opened the gift pack, his eyes snapped open and closed, and he was transported to another world. But that's not the worst thing. Perhaps it was because of the poor signal, that luxurious gift package that had come with him during his time travel. It took 5 or 6 years to finally connect and get the loading progress. 99%. Luke glanced at the progress bar in his consciousness space, a look of anticipation appearing on his face. For years, he has insisted on doing 100 push UPS, 100 sit UPS, and 100 squats every day, and actively sunbathing, all in preparation for the moment when the luxury gift package will be opened. Unfortunately, I don't know if it's because this place is too far from the neighboring film set and the signal is bad, or if there's some other reason. The progress bar remains stuck at 99%, refusing to move forward even a single step. This is something that gives Luke a real headache. They can't possibly make me collect an Infinity Stone to unlock it, can they? That's ridiculous. Luke pursed his lips, thinking, if only I could have Superman's powers. In this dangerous world, one can then develop steadily. Who knows, his life might be better than the one on the next film set. After all, it doesn't have such a dark art style. I crave cheat codes. Just as Luke let out his inner cry, the tavern door was pushed open. Ding dong. A clear, crisp bell rang out. Luke. I've been looking for you for so long. The young man, dressed in the brown uniform of an army soldier and holding a newspaper in his hand, spoke up. I went to your house, but you weren't home, so I came to old Joseph's tavern. I knew it was here. The handsome, spirited young man casually pulled out a chair and sat opposite Luke. I'm helping old Joseph at the shop, he's sick. Bucky, did you get orders? Luke removed the newspaper from his face and said lazily. The young man sitting opposite him was none other than the future Winter Soldier, Captain America's best friend, James Barnes. Bucky is his nickname, but it can also be used as a term of endearment, used only by close friends. Of course. 107th Infantry Regiment. You should now call me Sergeant James Barnes. I'll be setting sail for England tomorrow morning. Bucky puffed out his chest, head held high, a proud expression on his face. This was during World War II, and Uncle Sam's recruitment posters were everywhere in every state and region. The rousing slogans and ubiquitous television speeches inspired patriotism in a large number of young people. They couldn't wait to rush to the battlefield and win medals of honor. It's such a pity we can't be together, Luke said, feigning disappointment. He actually had no intention of joining the army. Having finally traveled through time, only to end up helping Uncle Sam fight the German Nazis, this internationalist spirit is truly touching. The reason I say this is simply to maintain my public image. In the current environment, joining the military is something most young people would do. Someone has to stay behind and look after Steve. That guy's always meddling, it's really worrying. Bucky patted his friend on the shoulder reassuringly. He and Luke had discussed in private that they hoped one of them could stay on the mainland. Unfortunately, Luke lost the drinking contest that decided who would join the army. Well, he did it on purpose. Actually, it's not bad when you think about it. All the men in New York have gone to serve in the military, leaving only 3.5 million women in the city. Maybe I'll have a chance to comfort some of them, those fragile and beautiful hearts." Luke joked. He and Bucky had known each other for several years. Both the other party and Steve Rogers were good friends of the original owner of this body. "Steve doesn't think that way, he's so stubborn." Bucky sighed. He frowned whenever he thought of that short, troublesome boy. The other side also wanted to go to the battlefield, just like me. However, he did not become the standard for military personnel. "When are we going to find Steve?" "He's probably at that movie theater again." Shaking off his worries, Bucky pulled a few tickets from his pocket and said excitedly, "We're going to Stark Industries World's Fair tonight. I've invited a few pretty girls." Chapter 2. As Luke and Bucky walked across the street to the movie theater, the future Captain America was getting beaten up in the alley behind the back door. A punch landed squarely on Steve Rogers' cheek, sending a sharp pain through him. Unsurprisingly, Rogers was knocked to the ground. His thin frame appeared especially small in comparison to the strong thug. This is why no one dared to stand up and stop the other party in the movie theater. Even though the strong thugs were shouting loudly and disregarding the opinions of others, no one wanted to get into unnecessary trouble. Only a fool like Rogers would risk getting beaten up to stop someone's impolite behavior. Rogers, who had fallen into the corner, grabbed the lid of a nearby trash can in a panic and used it as a shield. There was no fear in his eyes, but rather a resolute expression. Like a brave warrior. Unfortunately, the huge gap in size and strength cannot be bridged by courage alone. The burly thug swung his fist and knocked Rogers to the ground once again. But not long after, the slender little man struggled to his feet again, as if he felt no pain, and assumed a boxer's stance. "I could fight you all day long," Rogers said, panting. His punches were slow and lacked power, and were easily blocked by the strong thug. "Looks like you haven't had enough of a lesson yet." The villain sneered, and his clenched fist once again made intimate contact with Rogers' nose. He even wanted to kick him a couple more times, to teach this short, clueless guy what happens when you meddle in other people's business. Bang! A powerful force came from behind. The thug let out a scream, lost his balance, and stumbled against the wall. "Which neighborhood BD are you, daring to bully my friend in Brooklyn?" A cold voice sounded from behind. The thug quickly turned his head and saw two young men. One was wearing a crisp, well-fitting brown military uniform, the other a leather jacket. The latter was staring at him with sharp eyes. "Luke. That kid was being nosy. I had no idea he..." Bang! Without saying a word, Luke stepped forward and punched the thug in the nose. The other person leaned back and crashed heavily onto the hard ground. Fresh blood gushed from his nose like water from a tap that had been turned on. Luke didn't stop there. He raised his long leg, his dark black boot rubbing hard against the other man's contorted face. "Wah-ah-ah! Luke!" The mud and coal dust stuck to the solace of his shoes poured into the thug's mouth without warning. The blood seeping from his nose created a strange smell. "Get lost! If I see you bullying my friend again, I might go to your house and paint it." A moment later, Luke released his foot and said coldly. The thug, his face smeared with blood, ran out of the alley in a disheveled state, without even a thought of uttering a harsh word. There was no other way, the other party was Frank's nephew. Moreover, they are well regarded by the Irish Mafia, making them truly untouchable. "That's why I had Luke stay in Brooklyn to take care of you." Bucky, dressed in military uniform, reached out and helped Rogers up, a helpless expression on his face. "Sometimes I think you just enjoy getting beaten up, otherwise why do you always provoke these bastards you can't beat?" Rogers dusted off his clothes and hissed as he inhaled sharply. "The pain in my cheeks and eye sockets only then became clearly felt in my brain, a burning sensation." He had been so filled with courage that he had forgotten the pain in his body. Now, Rogers felt he needed to see a doctor. You went to the recruitment station again. Luke picked up the draft form from the ground. It contained Steve Rogers' identity information. The only change was that his place of residence changed from Brooklyn, New York to Paylams, New Jersey. It's illegal to falsify draft forms, Steve. Luke rubbed his hands together. Fortunately, this body was well trained and quite strong, so dealing with that villain was no problem for him. He, Rogers, and Bucky grew up in Brooklyn. However, compared to themselves, their experiences were more similar. First, both of his parents died in the war. Rogers' father served in the 107th Infantry Division and was killed by German mustard gas in a battle. My mother was a nurse in a tuberculosis ward. Unfortunately, she contracted the disease and did not survive. In a way, the future Captain America can be seen as a protagonist template for the tragic death of his parents. As for Bucky's background and experience, it's pretty much the same. His father, who also served in the 107th Infantry Division, died in an accident during a military exercise, and he was raised by his mother. That's why these two young people, who have known each other since childhood, became close partners. I just wanted to do something. Rogers lowered his head in slight frustration and coughed violently a few times. He was not only thin, but also had mild asthma. Symptoms such as chest tightness and difficulty breathing often occur. Sending someone with such a constitution to the battlefield would be tantamount to murder. Therefore, every time Rogers went to the recruitment station, he was refused to be accepted by the officers in charge of recruitment. You didn't need to be so fierce, Luke. Rogers looked up at his friend and hesitated before speaking. Luke frowned slightly, then relaxed, revealing a friendly smile. I had to do that. Otherwise, even more people in Brooklyn will bully you, and even cause trouble for us. Luke is right. If it weren't for his uncle's reputation among the Irish immigrant community, we don't know how much bullying we would have suffered at the hands of those thugs. Bucky nodded in agreement. He and Rogers had been bullied by those thugs quite a bit in the past. Almost every day is the same routine, being cornered and getting into a street brawl. Until one day they met Luke and became friends. Later it turned into cornering someone against a wall. Moreover, Bucky thought Luke was very intelligent. He came up with a money-making idea by taking advantage of the strict management of military bases, where soldiers could not leave at will. A few people secretly sneaked into the military camp, selling small commodities such as cigarettes and alcohol. Because of the protection of their parents and old comrades in arms, many people turned a blind eye to this and pretended not to see it. They made a lot of money from this business. This later attracted the attention of bootleggers in Brooklyn. It was only by proactively cultivating good relations with the Irish immigrant community and voluntarily sharing a portion of his business that Luke managed to avoid this trouble. That's good. You two can stay in the home country and continue running your business. By the time I come back, you might both be incredibly wealthy. Just like Howard Stark. Bucky joked. No one knows how long the war will last. For ordinary people, the hope is that the smoke of war will dissipate soon and life will return to normal. For others, however, this is a golden opportunity to make a fortune. Capitalists never miss any opportunity to amass wealth. Many people know that before the United States entered the World War, it sold large quantities of weapons and equipment to both the Axis and Allied powers, making a fortune from it. This includes Stark Industries, which has risen to prominence in recent years. Its rapid growth and rise to stand shoulder to shoulder with those established military-industrial groups was mainly due to Howard Stark seizing the opportunity. The other party not only used their intelligence but also some useful inventions, which earned them the appreciation of the Ministry of Defense. Moreover, he used the enormous wealth he earned to open doors to the upper class, thereby establishing a broad and solid network of connections. In just a few decades, he became a military industry tycoon. Besides the rapidly growing Stark Industries, oil companies also seized the opportunity. They bypassed the British blockade by using neutral countries like Switzerland to transport barrels of oil to Germany, thereby making huge profits and exploiting the national crisis. Ford, as a multinational corporation and industrial giant, is even more extravagant. They even helped the Germans produce trucks as a covered political investment. Therefore, Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Motor Company, was later awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit, the highest medal awarded by the German Nazis to foreigners. This shows that capital has no camps. Their sole purpose is to reap wealth. Even now that the United States has entered the war and joined the Allied camp, and the world situation is becoming increasingly severe, it still cannot stop speculators from having their own ulterior motives. Howard Stark, I don't have that kind of brain. Luke smiled slightly, then turned to Rogers and said, Steve, if you really want to join the army, there are so many recruiting stations. I can go with you to a few more, just to try our luck. Real? Rogers' face lit up with a delighted smile. Bucky had always opposed his enlistment in the army, and the two had argued about it several times. Luke rarely expresses his opinion, so his sudden endorsement of his approach today pleased Rogers. Bucky, who was standing next to him, was about to say something when he saw Luke give him a look that said, I know what I'm doing, so he kept quiet. He knew Luke, his usually taciturn friend, who never did anything without a reason. All right. Tonight is my last night in New York. You guys are planning to spend it in this alley. Bucky eagerly called to his two friends. He's going to the battlefield tomorrow, heading to a foreign land. Tonight I've specially invited a few hot and beautiful girls, planning to let Luke and Rogers have some fun. Chapter 3. By the time Luke and Bucky emerged from Rogers' house, it was already dusk, with the sun setting in the west. The afterglow of the setting sun illuminated New York, casting a dappled golden glow on the surrounding skyscrapers. Don't be so reckless in the future. Luke and I can't always get there in time. Bucky affectionately put his arm around Rogers' shoulder, while the skinny little guy looked awkward and remained silent. The injuries on his face were not serious. After some cleaning, only faint bruises remained. The three people from Brooklyn changed into brand new clothes. I'm getting ready to attend Stark Industries World's Fair tomorrow, and also to see Bucky off. I also want to be like you, joining the 107th Infantry Division, the place my father served. Rogers looked worried. He was still resentful that he couldn't join the army. Encouraged by public opinion, most young people at this time longed to join the army, go to the battlefield, and win medals that symbolized honor. Rogers and Bucky were among them. However, compared to the strong and powerful Bucky, Rogers was thin and weighed less than 100 pounds, and also suffered from mild asthma. Let alone joining the army, even running a few thousand meters would leave him breathless. Therefore, even though Rogers changed his address and forged his identity every time he went to the recruiting station to look for opportunities, he was still rejected. Because his medical examination results are always 4F, a completely unacceptable score. There's always a chance. With his hands in his pockets, Luke, walking behind, chuckled. He was considering whether he should try to obtain the super soldier serum. Years of consistent training have propelled the progress bar to 99%, just one step away from activation. An inexplicable intuition told Luke that perhaps a sufficiently powerful external force was needed to achieve 100%. Currently, the only thing he can most easily obtain, and has the best chance of getting, is the super soldier serum. As a time traveler who had a general understanding of the plot, Luke naturally knew that tonight would be a turning point in Steve Rogers' fate. This thin, short man encountered Dr. Abraham Erskine, a German scientist who had defected to the Allies and was also the developer of the super soldier serum. The other person was moved by Steve Rogers' heartfelt words and thus gained the opportunity to enlist in the army. He then came to the attention of the military and was selected to be a recipient of the super soldier serum. Should we infiltrate their ranks? Luke, walking behind, was deep in thought. If he could develop quietly, he definitely wouldn't choose to join the army. After all, the battlefield is a place of constant gunfire and danger. Even following Captain America and the Winter Soldier doesn't guarantee safety. However, the cheat software was delayed, which gave Luke a major headache. Having no other options, he had no choice but to take a gamble. Although many people in my past life believed that I was as sturdy as a defensive tower. However, it's not so hard to accept taking a little risk for the cheats you get by spending real money. While Luke was lost in thought, he followed Rogers and Bucky to the small tavern on the street corner. The group ordered some beer and snacks, chatting aimlessly while waiting for the Stark Industries hosted World's Fair to begin. Rogers still looked somewhat sullen, suggesting he hadn't given up on the idea of joining the army. Pakistan, however, was completely oblivious, already lost in his dream of defeating the Nazis and the Allied victory. "Let's go. I specially arranged for you to meet a pretty girl." Bucky checked the time and pulled Rogers out of the tavern. The streets outside were pitch black, except for the brightly lit Expo 2019 venue, which stood out prominently. At this time, World War II was raging, and like other European countries, the United States was also at the forefront of the conflict. To conserve energy, the military implemented blackout regulations. Neon lights and colorful billboards are restricted from being turned off once night falls. Every night, the city experiences frequent power outages, prioritizing power supply to military bases and government agencies. Even New York is no exception. Tonight is because of Stark Industries World's Fair tomorrow. The military made an exception and allowed the restrictions to be relaxed. Otherwise, New Yorkers wouldn't see the dazzling neon lights. "It's really lively," Bucky cheered. The interior of the expo venue was bustling with activity. Crowds surged, fireworks blazed. Young men and women were seen hugging and embracing everywhere, and the air was thick with hormones. Luke and his group stood beneath the enormous metal globe, silently enduring their public displays of affection, waiting for the beautiful girl they had arranged to meet. Not long after, 3 lively young girls arrived on time. They wore brightly colored cotton dresses and flat shoes, looking both enthusiastic and reserved. "Girls, they are my friends." Bucky waved and pointed to Luke and Rogers behind him. The lively young girls, ignoring the petite and slender Luke, all turned their attention to him. At this time, Steve Rogers was not yet the future captain with his big pecs, nor did he have the so-called American butt, so naturally he couldn't attract young and beautiful girls. But Luke. His appearance is quite appealing. His clean-cut short black hair and slightly aloof young face are very likely to arouse the fiery passion of young girls. "Stop stern. Rogers, you need to learn to have fun." Bucky put his arm around the thin, small boy's shoulder and patiently taught him. Luke, who was walking ahead, was surrounded by young girls, listening to them chatter about trivial matters. The group walked through a plaza displaying metal globes, past some secondary exhibition halls, and entered the core area. "Welcome to the Modern Wonders Pavilion." The narrator paused slightly, then emphasized, "The world of the future. A greater world. A better world. It all begins with Stark Industries." People passing by exclaimed in admiration, their eyes filled with curiosity. Steel mannequins in glass display cases, model airplanes suspended from the ceiling, glass curtain walls repeatedly playing Howard Stark's speeches. These are undoubtedly advanced and eye-catching new products at present. However, Luke didn't seem to care about this. He himself comes from the 21st century, and in his previous life he watched countless science fiction movies. Those trinkets displayed in the showcases are hard to find interesting. The young girls, one on each side of his arm, chattered on and on as if they had discovered a new continent. This gave Luke a bit of a headache. How he longed to be like Rogers, strolling leisurely behind with a bucket of popcorn, enjoying a moment of peace. Seemingly sensing Luke's mood, Rogers, who was left alone, picked up a few kernels of popcorn and popped them into his mouth, a gloating and mocking expression on his face. However, Luke was soon freed. The two female companions surrounding him suddenly let out screams like fans of a celebrity and rushed to the stage of one of the exhibition areas. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Howard Stark." As the host finished speaking, the curtain rose. Several beautiful women dressed in tight-fitting vests and black tuxedos made a grand appearance in front of a red car. Then, Howard Stark, sporting a small mustache, walked onto the stage. A burst of enthusiastic applause erupted from the audience. Howard Stark, a young billionaire of our time. A brilliant young genius, a womanizer who frequents brothels. There has never been a shortage of gossip and rumors about him. Howard, who gracefully emerged from behind the scenes, did not greet the audience. Instead, he embraced and kissed a beautiful woman on stage, a confident and charming smile on his face. No wonder he's Iron Man's dad. Standing below the stage, Luke silently gave a thumbs up. Thinking about the future Iron Man, who once had the astonishing feat of sleeping with every cover girl on a magazine for a whole year, it seems that womanizing is a trait inherited from the Stark family. Chapter 4. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the future world created by Stark Industries. Believe it or not, a wave of new technologies is sweeping across the world, and perhaps in a few years, cars will never touch the ground again. Taking the microphone, pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his lips, Iron Man's dad began his performance. He seemed to enjoy the attention he received from the audience, while simultaneously promoting his company's innovative technology and instructing the pretty woman to remove the four wheels from the red car. Standing on the stage, Howard Stark didn't look like a scientist, he looked more like a magician with a deep understanding of performance techniques. Knowing how to use techniques to capture the audience's attention. Stark Industries' latest anti-gravity technology will make all of this possible. Howard smiled and turned on the instrument. The car, with its wheels removed, slowly floated to the surface. This incredible scene left the audience holding their breath. Luke's lips twitched slightly, he wasn't interested in Howard Stark's gadgets. Although the other party can be considered one of the most intelligent geniuses in the world today, he is like Tony Stark, who is still in his formative years. They all share a common characteristic, or rather, a personality flaw inherited from their family. That means they're difficult to deal with. Perhaps this can be attributed to a common ailment among geniuses. Taking this opportunity, Luke secretly slipped out of the crowd and escaped the unwanted attention of the young women. Let the vibrant and gentle embrace of youth be left for Bucky, who is about to head to England to serve his country. Turning his head unintentionally, Luke saw Rogers's thin back. He left the crowd gathered on the stage and walked towards the recruitment station not far away. Luke took a deep breath, thinking that this was the beginning of Captain America. He put his hands in his pockets, considering what he should do. Although it is said that developing slowly and cautiously is the right way. But who knows when the golden finger will arrive? Moreover, going to the Marvel set just to live a peaceful life like an ordinary person seems like a waste of a time travel opportunity. As he pondered, Luke spotted the figure of an old man again. He had grey hair, was somewhat bald, and wore glasses on his nose. Abraham Erskine. Luke recognized the other person. The German scientist who developed the super soldier serum and created Red Skull, the leader of Hydra, slowly walked into the recruitment station. It seems there's still a stalker. Luke, who was about to follow, suddenly turned serious. He saw several men in black wearing round hats following behind Abraham Erskine. They had bulges around their waists, looked nervous, and glanced around nervously. They didn't look like ordinary tourists, and their identities were quite different from those of the accompanying bodyguards. Hydra. A thought popped into Luke's mind. As the developer of the super soldier serum, Dr. Erskine was undoubtedly a thorn in Hydra's side. The Red Skull Society will do everything in its power to eliminate this threat. Once the Allies obtain the super soldier serum and can produce a large number of super soldiers, the outcome of this war will be a foregone conclusion. In a flash of thought, Luke also walked into that recruitment station. Steve. Bucky snapped out of his reverie of Howard Stark's performance, turned to look at his sullen friend, only to find that the other had already vanished. Luke. He looked at Luke again, but to his surprise, Luke was nowhere to be seen. What's going on? Where did everyone go? Bucky muttered something, then was dragged away to other exhibits by his remaining female companions. The battlefield is not for you. At the recruitment station, Rogers was rejected once again. The officer recruiting soldiers saw his thin frame and made his decision without a second thought, without even looking at the completed application form. Despite Rogers's reasoned arguments and earnest words. No matter what he said, the officer just shook his head. In his view, sending this frail little man to the battlefield was no different from murder. You have many other things you can do, you don't necessarily have to join the army. We're in dire need of manpower right now. You could go to a factory to manufacture weapons for the front lines, or find another job. The officer said impatiently. He pushed Rogers' draft form back, his face showing a cold, no discussion expression. War is not a fight. Going to the battlefield will only be a burden to others. It's better to stay home and work from the rear. Be content, kid. Not having to risk your life weaving through gunfire is something most people can only dream of. Looking at the thin, short man in front of him, the recruiting officer said this. He couldn't understand why the other person insisted on joining the army. Wouldn't it be better to stay in the homeland? There was no danger to their lives, nor did they have to experience the cruelty of war. No matter how precious a medal symbolizing honor may be, is it more important than being alive? Everyone knows that the Allied and Axis powers are locked in a fierce battle. Every battlefield is like a meat grinder, constantly devouring the flesh and blood of both sides. The exact number of corpses that were filled into the trench is probably only known to God. Sir. I want to serve my country. I want to do something. I'm sure I can do something. The recruiting officer avoided Rogers's determined gaze and shook his head again. Everything had to be done according to the rules, he couldn't recruit an unqualified soldier. The two men's gradually increasing voices attracted Abraham Erskine's attention. He looked at Rogers, who looked dejected, as if he had thought of something. It really does follow the exact trajectory of history. Luke watched quietly from the side, a slight smile playing on his lips. However, he quickly suppressed his smile, because behind Abraham Erskine, the men in black who had been following him were approaching. Their eyes were cold, their faces filled with murderous intent, and their right hands slowly reached towards the bulge at their waists. Almost instantly, the man in black then lifted the corner of his shirt. Pull out the hidden pistol. The cold muzzle of the gun was pointed at Abraham Erskine. It seemed like he was about to pull the trigger any second. Bang! A gunshot rang out. The crowd at the recruitment station immediately descended into chaos, their panicked screams spreading like steam billowing from a locomotive. Those new recruits, dressed in military uniforms but not yet enlisted, suddenly became like ants on a hot pan, running around aimlessly. They had never been on the battlefield, nor had they received any formal training, they had absolutely no idea what to do. The officer in charge of guarding the area lay in a pool of blood, a bullet hole protruding from his white round cap. Blood gushed from the back of his head, making his contorted face all the more gruesome. Hurry up! Luke, who was hiding nearby, helped Dr. Erskine up from the ground and turned into a cubicle in the corridor. Intense gunfire erupted from behind, bullets striking the wall and sending up plumes of dust. Luke glanced at Rogers, who was hiding behind a cabinet with his hands behind his head, and a strange thought popped into his head. If the future Captain America dies, how will things unfold? Will a new hero be introduced? Or will the Third Reich win the war, and the Red Skull conquer the world? Thud. 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 The clear sound of a gunshot interrupted Luke's distracting thoughts. He glanced at the nervous Dr. Erskine and whispered, "You stay here. Don't wander around." Outside the cubicle, the sound of footsteps, tap tap tap, gradually approached. The drawn curtains revealed a figure holding a gun, illuminated by the lamplight. Luke touched the Colt M1911 on his back, took a deep breath, and suddenly rushed out of the corridor cubicle. Chapter 5. You lost Dr. Erskine. Turning the clock back 5 minutes, a tall female officer asked in a stern tone. German spies are very likely lurking in this city, ready to arrest or execute Dr. Erskine at any moment. Don't you know how important he is? Go find him now. The female officer reprimanded her subordinates without any politeness. Her strikingly beautiful face was framed by a cold, aloof expression, like an iceberg. The plainclothes agent nodded repeatedly, trying his best to conceal the dismissive contempt in his eyes. This was a turbulent era in which the status of women was not yet valued. The prevailing view is that women should stay at home as full-time housewives and do housework, and that they don't need to show their faces in public. Even though the stern-looking female officer in front of them was their superior, they had to maintain an attitude of obedience. However, the level of respect shown by these plainclothes agents was still very perfunctory. To them, the female officer was a pretty, grumpy woman, not their superior. We got separated from him. There were so many people at the expo, who knows where that old German man went? That's what one plainclothes agent said in his defense. He is Dr. Abraham Erskine. The female officer corrected her. This does not change the fact that he and Hitler were compatriots. Another plainclothes agent retorted with a cold laugh. Due to deliberate propaganda in public opinion, the public harbors a clear sense of hostility towards Germans. Even though Abraham Erskine was in the Allied camp, it couldn't stop these people's prejudices. Bang! Clear gunshots rang out in the distance. Faint screams of panic could still be heard. The female officer's expression changed. She gave the plainclothes agent a cold look, then quickly walked away in her flat shoes. 3 minutes later, she arrived at the recruitment station with a squad of heavily armed soldiers. Several cold corpses lay on the ground, and the pungent stench of blood filled the entire area. Ph.D. The female officer breathed a sigh of relief when she saw that Dr. Erskine was unharmed. The enemy is now a top-level protected target by the military and a major concern for the Germans. Everyone in the know understands just how valuable the super soldier serum developed by Abraham Erskine truly is. It can end this war. The scales that tipped the scales of victory. It could even influence the world's Gaju, a concept encompassing overall structure, overall situation, and overall dynamics. These people must be spies they sent. Dr. Erskine, having recovered from his initial panic, calmly stated, "It seems Schmidt really doesn't want me to live in this world." The female officer nodded in agreement. Then, she glanced at the 2 young men next to Dr. Erskine out of the corner of her eye, a hint of wariness in her eyes. "Thank goodness this young man saved me. By the way, I still don't know your name." Dr. Erskine explained. Seeing Luke single-handedly and narrowly defeat 3 spies who were tailing him for an assassination attempt, he assumed they were undercover agents sent by the military to protect him. However, judging from the female officer's wary gaze, that was clearly not the case. "Luke. My name is Luke Cavell." The young man, who had put away his pistol, smiled. He never imagined that he would meet Abraham Erskine and Captain America's girlfriend, Peggy Carter, in this way. "That's right. The female officer standing before me is one of the founders of SHIELD in the future. Currently, the other party should be an agent of the Strategic Scientific Legion. He was responsible for protecting Abraham Erskine and for participating in the Super Soldier program. You killed all these spies? Not bad." "It was Peggy Carter, the female officer," she said meaningfully. She glanced briefly at the bodies of the black-clad spies, All three had been killed with a single shot, leaving no trace of external injury, the bullets all hitting vital organs. Judging from the wounds alone, this young man named Luke is an excellent shot. Moreover, after killing the three people, the other party did not show any intense panic. By all accounts, he doesn't seem like a novice. Such unusual behavior gave Peggy every reason to be suspicious. It's impossible to say that an ordinary young man in Brooklyn could easily defeat a German spy. In that case, the Allies would have already reached Berlin and ended the war. I've learned some self-defense techniques, Luke answered casually. He did indeed learn combat and shooting from Uncle Frank for a period of time. The latter once considered training Luke to be a gang thug who cleans houses. The Irish Mafia is on the rise and is in dire need of capable young men. Unfortunately, Luke wasn't interested in this path. Although he worked hard to learn combat and shooting, and persisted in physical training, it was only to increase his means of self-defense. I'm not some donut-shaped hairdresser who wants to become a gangster superstar. Doctor, it's not safe here. Let's leave now. The female officer withdrew her scrutinizing gaze, looked at Dr. Erskine beside her, and said softly, "We will investigate all of this afterwards." "Okay. I'll remember your name, Luke." Dr. Erskine nodded. He knew he was under tight military protection. "I was able to attend the World Expo tonight at the invitation of Howard Stark." However, after meeting him once, Dr. Erskine felt that the young and promising Mr. Stark spoke more like a businessman. His passion for climbing the heights of science paled in comparison to his interest in accumulating wealth and pursuing women. So, the two exchanged only a few pleasantries and didn't continue their conversation. "Is he your friend?" Before leaving, Erskine glanced at Steve Rogers standing to the side. For some reason, he was very interested in this thin, short man. Perhaps it was the conversation between the other party and the recruiting officer that stirred up some memories deep within Erskine's heart. As the developer of the super soldier serum, Abraham Erskine knew its dangers and its side effects. "I've already created one devil, I don't want to create a second, or any more." Therefore, Erskine was searching for the right person, a super soldier who wouldn't bully the weak and who knew compassion. "Yes. His name is Steve Rogers." Luke pulled Steve aside and said loudly, "My friend longs to serve his country. Although he's not strong enough, his patriotism has never faded." "I see." Erskine seemed thoughtful, then turned and left. The female officer quickly followed, but before leaving, she glanced at Luke, seemingly still harboring some doubts. The heavily armed soldiers stayed behind to protect the scene and clean up the mess. "Luke, who are they?" Steve, who had escaped unharmed, was somewhat bewildered. He didn't yet know what had happened. "The person who can change your destiny." Luke pursed his lips and said softly. He patted Steve's thin shoulder, a glimmer of light appearing deep in his eyes. "I never expected to come to the military's attention in this way. It's likely that the next female agent, Peggy Carter, will conduct a thorough investigation into Luke." However, he was not worried. The Strategic Science Legion was destined to gain nothing. Their enemy is Hydra, the evil Axis powers. Luke has absolutely no connection to the so-called German spies or the assassins sent by Hydra. That was terrifying. Steve, who hadn't understood what was being said, was still shaken. The recruiting officer who had argued with him also fell in a pool of blood. Empty eyes, devoid of all color. If you go to the battlefield, you'll encounter many more things like this, and witness many more comrades fall. Luke sighed. He had seen Uncle Frank paint houses. He even personally dealt with a few gangsters. We've long been accustomed to bloodshed and death. Will I ever have another chance to step onto the battlefield? Steve was somewhat frustrated. He had been rejected far too many times. Everyone said he wasn't good enough and that he should stay in his home country. Even his best friend Bucky was no exception. It will happen. Luke nodded firmly. He seemed more confident than Steve himself. All right, hurry up and find Bucky. We're giving him a send-off tonight. Sensing Steve's questioning gaze, Luke changed the subject, dragging the thin, short man away from the recruiting station. Chapter 6. The next day, early morning. Luke got out of bed early, washed up, and went about his usual training regimen of becoming bald and stronger. Push UPS, squats, sit UPS, sunbathing. After a series of procedures, the hands of the clock on the wall had already slid to 8:20. Packy should all be on board by now. Luke closed the door and prepared to go find Rogers. They had originally planned to see Bucky off, but Sergeant James Barnes, who was heading to England, said he didn't want his friends to see him looking so weak and helpless. Last night, the entire city of New York was probably engulfed in gunfire. With his crisp military uniform and a few sweet words, he won over many hearts. Young men with high hormone levels can easily win over beautiful girls. Perhaps this is the reward for serving one's country. Good morning, Luke. The florist downstairs called out enthusiastically, Frank is looking for you. He seems to be in a bad mood. Got it. Thank you, Uncle Dale. Luke stopped and changed direction, heading towards Uncle Frank's house. It was probably some street thug from yesterday who went to complain to his boss, and then it got back to my uncle through the Irish Mafia. 10 minutes later, Luke skillfully pulled the key from under the doormat and opened the door. Uncle Frank, I brought you some roasted mushrooms and potato pancakes from Aunt Bertha's. Carrying a steaming, hearty breakfast, Luke walked into the living room and saw an old man with grey hair and a slightly hunched back. Judging solely from his appearance and physique, one can vaguely discern a resemblance to his rugged and strong self in his youth. Luke. You annoying brat! Upon seeing Luke, the old man angrily launched into a tirade, that Sissy B.D. Hobson went to Mr. Hoffa again to complain that you beat up one of his underlings. Hobson even has to tell Mr. Hoffa about this? Then why doesn't he tell Mr. Hoffa that his mother died on the toilet a few days ago? Luke feigned surprise, his hands still busy taking out plates and cutlery from the cupboard. Eat it while it's hot. Aunt Bertha specially added meat filling to the potato pancakes. The old man named Frank sat at the table, saying, Don't think you can bribe me with this. Luke, you troublemaker, the last Italian, it tasted amazing. I could eat it forever. As it turns out, no one can escape the it's actually pretty good phenomenon. After Frank finished his breakfast, he never mentioned Hobson and his henchmen again. He mentioned more about getting Luke to join the rapidly growing Irish mob. Mr. Hoffa values you highly. That great idea of doing business with the military camp got the gang some obsolete firearms. Those Italians haven't been as arrogant as before lately. Frank couldn't understand why his nephew was so opposed to joining a gang. A Brooklyn street hustler with nothing to do, who desperately wants to join a gang and become one of its leaders. At least that way no one will bully me anymore. No interest. If I really want to join a gang, I'd rather go back to school. Luke made himself a cup of coffee and said calmly. He knew this was the most turbulent period in American history, just as the newspapers said, violence, like cherry jam pie, is an American specialty. Since the Prohibition order, all sorts of gangs have sprung up like mushrooms after rain. They were initially mostly poor immigrant groups, such as the Irish and Italians. Unlike the British and Germans who brought large sums of money to develop North America, their so-called immigrants were simply people who moved to another place to continue living as the lower class. Many people can't even afford to rent a house, so they have to do the hardest and most tiring jobs. Immigrant groups living together gradually formed slums. That's how the infamous Hell's Kitchen in New York came to be. As one sociologist has said, poverty often breeds nationalism. Because the Irish and Italians were both Catholics, they were considered savages who could not be assimilated in predominantly Christian North America. The pervasive exclusion and discrimination make life very difficult for these immigrant groups. Thus, in order to resist the exploitation by foremen and religious persecution, the Irish and Italians spontaneously formed various violent groups. This was the prototype of the American Mafia. Back then, gangs were just groups of poor people and were not taken seriously. Later, a special group known as city bosses began to emerge. They were a profession that emerged with the rise of industrial society, whose main responsibilities were to raise campaign funds for political party candidates and to buy votes, in other words, brokers in later generations. As we all know, the United States is a country of immigrants. Previously, no one respected those immigrant groups who were of low social status and lived in poverty. However, the city bosses keenly recognized their value, and the gangs that were initially formed by workers gradually changed. One accepts the protection of special interest groups, while the other provides politicians with a stable pool of votes. The two sides hit it off immediately. However, no one could have predicted what would happen next. The Prohibition Act provided gangs with a great deal of wealth, and the rise of labor unions and frequent labor movements further fueled this growth. The monster that is the gang has finally torn open the cage of social law. They possess ample wealth in one hand and use their votes to cultivate relationships with politicians in the other. They also cooperated with labor unions to obtain legal status. It developed rapidly in a short period of time. Like Uncle Frank's Irish gang, they had close ties with Mr. Jimmy Hoffa, a high-ranking member of the National Truck Drivers Brotherhood. This union represented nearly 1 million truck drivers and warehouse workers, and at its peak, it had as many as 2,300,000 members. It can be said that if one can get the help of the labor union when running for mayor or councillor, it is no different from declaring victory directly. Gangs, labor unions, and politicians form a tightly knit chain of interests. Unfortunately, this glory did not last long. Luke thought to himself, whether they are Irish or Italian, their power was once at its zenith. The former successfully helped Kennedy get elected president, while the latter had close ties with J. Edgar Hoover, the first director of the FBI. However, gangs are ultimately just a deformed product of periods of social unrest. With the end of World War II, their decline was inevitable. They have become tools in the hands of politicians and interest groups, and will never regain their former glory. Even becoming a mob boss in the Marvel Universe has no future, not even with Kingpin status. This is what Luke was thinking. You damned brat Gao Yuan. I told you to join the gang, but you wouldn't. I offered you a truck driver job, to take over my position, but you refused. Do you really think you can be a war hero? Frank got angry when he saw Luke's nonchalant attitude. He had a good relationship with Mr. Jimmy Hoffa of the National Truck Drivers Brotherhood, so he couldn't afford to paint houses. After retiring, he served as the honorary president of a branch of the union. Although it's just a nominal position, I still receive a generous salary every month. If he put in a good word for Luke, the gang and Mr. Hoffa would probably take extra care of him. Uncle Frank, don't worry about that. Here, cover yourself with the blanket. Luke didn't argue, and chuckled as he covered Frank's legs with a thick blanket. If he had followed Captain America and joined the Howling Commandos, he might have actually earned the honor of being a war hero. Unfortunately, even if they become heroes, they are still tools and mascots in the hands of politicians and capitalists. Therefore, Luke had another idea. Chapter 7. New York, a military camp. In the conference room, a smart and capable female military officer was reporting the situation to her superior. Colonel Phillips, I think there's something wrong with that guy named Luke Cavell. After briefly summarizing the attack Dr. Erskine encountered at the Exposition of Tomorrow, Carter spoke of Luke, who was listed as a suspect. I've seen the wounds of those German spies, they were all killed with a single shot. An ordinary person couldn't possibly do that. Cavell must have practiced marksmanship, and been exceptionally skilled. The female officer stated her conclusion with certainty. Even after leaving the recruitment station, her doubts never disappeared. It sounds unbelievable that a young man from Brooklyn could single-handedly take down a highly trained professional spy. There are just too many things that don't make sense. Therefore, Carter believed that this was very likely a Hydra conspiracy. By sacrificing those German spies, they gained the opportunity to get close to Dr. Erskine. Then, they will carry out their evil plan. Germany might prefer kidnapping Dr. Erskine to killing him. The value of the super soldier serum is undeniable. Whoever obtains it will be able to influence the course of world wars. The influence and threat it could pose should not be underestimated. Colonel Phillips, seated in his seat, shook his head and said in a deep voice, "He's fine. I've had someone investigate. Luke Cavell, his parents were Irish immigrants, they died early, and he dropped out of Bronx Science High School at 17. His teachers were very sorry because Cavell had excellent grades and was very talented. He received scholarships every year. Then why did he drop out of school?" Carter expressed his confusion. "You know, Irish immigrants aren't well received. Being bullied and pranked is very common. Therefore, Cavell often gets into fights at school. When teachers encounter this, they can only call his parents, but he doesn't have any parents." Colonel Phillips shrugged, saying helplessly, "After fighting with those kids at school, he also has to deal with unreasonable adults. For a 17-year-old, this isn't an easy problem to handle." Carter fell silent. She could imagine how difficult those years must have been for Luke Cavell, an orphan. But, where did he get his hands on the gun, and learn how to shoot? Carter hesitated before speaking. Through the colonel's explanation, she dispelled her doubts. Carter simply couldn't understand how an ordinary young man from Brooklyn could have such accurate marksmanship. Cavell's uncle Frank is a veteran, the kind who's actually been through the fighting and survived. He later joined the Irish Mafia, doing some dirty work, and is now retired and the honorary president of a branch of the Truck Drivers Union. Colonel Phillips shared the findings of his investigation with his subordinates. Carter has always been very competitive and has excellent work skills. However, she was somewhat obsessed with showing off, wanting to prove herself to be on par with any man. This gave Colonel Phillips a real headache. He wouldn't have been so good-natured if the other person hadn't been British and not affiliated with any faction of the American military. After all, the members of the Strategic Scientific Corps are diverse, including talents drawn from all over the world. Carter was one of them. Luke Cavell wasn't a German spy, he had absolutely no connection to the Germans. I don't think Hitler, no matter how skilled he was at manipulating people, could possibly turn a young man who grew up in Brooklyn into a German spy. Of course, Cavell has done some less than honorable things, but the Strategic Scientific Legion has no interest in those. Fighting gangs isn't our job. Fighting Hydra, crushing the Axis powers, and winning the war, that's what we're after." Colonel Phillips emphasized, signaling to his subordinates that they should stop dwelling on this person. He didn't want Carter to stir up a hornet's nest with the Irish mob. Those people are now working in concert with labor unions to help politicians garner votes and interfere in elections. In recent years, their influence has grown increasingly stronger. Even Colonel Phillips didn't want to get involved in this unnecessary trouble. Who knows how many members of Congress are backing them? Then, as if remembering something, he said, "However, Erskine seems quite interested in those too." "Luke Cavell, and what's the little guy's name?" "Steve Rogers." Carter replied. Yes. Erskine wants to recruit both of them to the Caspian Sea training camp." Colonel Phillips paused for a moment, then asked, "What do you think about this, Carter?" The Caspian Sea training camp, ostensibly, was a place for training new recruits. Its real purpose, however, was to select test subjects for the super soldier serum. Erskine's implication was undoubtedly that Luke Cavell and Steve Rogers should be selected. Colonel Phillips saw no problem with the former. Luke was tall and strong, and he single-handedly took down 3 German spies. Even if he isn't ultimately selected, it doesn't diminish the fact that he would be a good soldier. But Steve Rogers? That small, thin boy who looked like he could be blown away by a gust of wind? It would be utterly ridiculous for the Allies to rely on someone like this for salvation. If this is Dr. Erskine's idea, then I think it's fine, Colonel. Carter thought for a moment and then gave his answer. All right, I'll leave this to you. I want to see them on the bus to New Jersey. Colonel Phillips nodded and handed over the task. He figured it out, with Rogers' physique, he probably wouldn't even make it through basic recruit training anyway. As for being chosen to become a super soldier, Colonel Phillips preferred to believe that Adolf Hitler would have a change of heart and immediately surrender. Knock knock knock. Luke returned to his residence and opened the door. Steve, can you tell me what's going on? Looking at Rogers standing outside the door, and the female officer with an icy expression, Luke asked in surprise. He had considered that the Strategic Scientific Corps might investigate him, and perhaps even take him in for questioning under the guise of assisting in the investigation. As a key figure under military protection, Abraham Erskine fully deserves this level of protection. Only, Steve, what's up with you being so happy? He could barely contain his smile. Is being taken in for interrogation by secret agents a good thing? Luke. I can enlist. We're leaving for New Jersey tomorrow. Roger's joy was almost like a volcanic eruption. His pent-up frustration from the past few days finally dissipated. Luke's heart skipped a beat, and he immediately realized what was going on. This means I've been recruited. Despite the changes in the plot, due to the inertia of the timeline, Steve Rogers still embarks on the path to becoming Captain America. I thought the process would be a bit more complicated. Luke composed himself and regained his composure. It seems the plan to obtain the super soldier serum has successfully taken its first step. Luke Cavil, are you willing to serve your country and join this war for freedom against fascism? Carter asked coldly. It's as if I have the right to refuse. Luke glanced at the two heavily armed soldiers standing behind Carter and thought to himself. Since he had chosen this method to come into the military's view and arouse Dr. Erskine's interest. At this moment, there will be no more backing down. Ahem, since the organization has already made its decision, then I. Luke suppressed his urge to recite a couple of lines of poetry on the spot and accepted the military's call-up. Chapter 8. The next day, early morning. Luke, handpicked by the military, packed some simple belongings and, along with an excited Rogers, boarded a special vehicle bound for the Caspian Sea training camp in New Jersey. Before setting off, they met with several key members of the Strategic Scientific Corps. For example, Colonel Phillips with a serious expression. Dr. Abraham Erskine, the developer of the super soldier serum. Howard Stark, famous in New York. And then there's Agent Carter, who, as always, maintains her aloof and icy expression. Etc. The Strategic Scientific Corps was a temporary organization established by the Allied powers specifically to win the war. It was personally approved by President Roosevelt and the heads of state of various European countries. It has assembled elites from various fields, with the primary objective of combating Hydra, the Third Reich's nefarious organization symbolized by the monster Hydra. The secondary objective was to implement the Super Soldier program and end the war that was sweeping the world. The current leader of Hydra is John Schmidt, nicknamed Red Skull. He was said to be one of Hitler's closest confidants. Heinrich Himmler wielded even more power than Heinrich Himmler, who participated in the establishment of the SS and served as the head of the Gestapo, the secret police. Actually, Red Skull may not have been the founder of Hydra. Sitting in the back of the transport truck, swaying from side to side, Luke thought to himself. He recalled reading in the comics that the authentic Hydra originated quite early, dating back to an even more distant era. Red Skull simply used that name and changed the concept to create a useful tool. In this respect, he shares some similarities with Adolf Hitler, who was once idolized by the Third Reich. Luke, Do you think we might run into Bucky? Rogers asked, clutching his luggage. Thinking of Bucky's surprised expression when he learned that he had been drafted into the military and was going to the battlefield, he couldn't help but look forward to their next meeting. Bucky may have already set foot on English soil by this time, fighting for freedom. Luke laughed. He understood why Rogers was so determined to serve in the military. A short man who has long been ridiculed and bullied because of his thin physique. There are often only two paths to the future. Either you, like Rogers, maintain an optimistic and positive attitude. It can lead to a cynical, self-isolated, and negative mindset. The former is rare, the latter is abundant. And that's probably why Steve Rogers became Captain America. He is a person who is always on the right path. Rogers' enthusiasm for military service was not driven by strong patriotism. He was not the type to desperately exchange honors for medals or dream of making a name for himself. This skinny little guy was probably more interested in proving that he was no different from those strong guys. Luke, then tell me, why did Howard Stark go to the Caspian Sea training camp? Was he also a conscript? Rogers asked curiously. He knew nothing about the Super Soldier program or the Strategic Scientific Corps. He assumed that he was going to the Caspian Sea training camp to receive basic training. Stark is different from us. He's a science advisor. He's a full-fledged high-ranking military officer. Luke shook his head. How could the two new recruits possibly compare to Howard Stark? The treatment for the two sides is completely different. Howard Stark was able to ride in a smooth and comfortable private car, chatting and laughing with a group of high-ranking military officers along the way. They might even go out for a night of revelry and debauchery. He and Rogers, however, could only stay in the back of the transport truck, which swayed like a rocking ship. Get ready for basic training, Rogers. Luke smiled meaningfully. For Rogers, who was far from being physically strong, recruit training was no easy task. 1 week later. Are you all right, Rogers? Luke, having finished his weighted cross-country run, handed a towel to the skinny little guy. He looked like he'd been pulled out of the water. His camouflage uniform was soaked with sweat. His chest heaved violently, like a bellows being pulled, making a whooshing sound. Even a regular 5 kilometers trail run is a daunting challenge for Rogers, whose physical condition is not very good. No, it's nothing. I just need to rest for a bit, and I'll be fine. Luke watched Rogers, who was speaking haltingly, fearing he might suddenly faint. The fact that this thin, hunched-over man has managed to persevere until now is truly remarkable. He certainly has incredible willpower. Despite always finishing training last and having the worst results each day, Rogers consistently performed poorly. But in terms of effort, he is no less than others, and may even be more so. I feel much better. Thank you, Luke. After catching his breath, Rogers looked up at his friend and gave him a grateful smile. If it weren't for Luke's help, his situation might have been much worse. In Rogers' view, the Caspian training camp was no different from the streets of Brooklyn. There are bastards everywhere who use their strong muscles to bully those weaker than themselves. Thankfully, Luke stepped in, otherwise, Rogers would have become another victim of thugs cornering and beating him. Gather! Gather! At the sound of a sharp whistle, the new recruits, who had long since developed a conditioned reflex, jogged over and formed neat rows. Some of them have already experienced the consequences of disobeying orders, or being a troublemaker. That aloof female officer with a strong British accent was not as delicate as she appeared. Gilmer Hodge, the recruit who was punched, has a lot to say about this. He still has a band-aid on his nose. Moreover, the high-intensity physical training every day is enough to release everyone's excess energy. Based on your observations over the past few days, who is the recruit with the best grades and the most outstanding performance? Standing not far away, watching the group of new recruits being reprimanded, Colonel Phillips asked. It's Luke Cavell. Carter, holding the score sheet, raised an eyebrow. She truly hadn't expected that young man from Brooklyn. Not only was his marksmanship amazing, but he also performed exceptionally well in other test items. Physical training includes shooting, target practice, weighted marches, and climbing barbed wire. Luke easily took first place and left the second place finisher far behind. I knew it. Erskine, I told you, Cavill is the most suitable candidate. Colonel Phillips clapped his hands and said. He looked at Luke, who was tall, strong, and powerful in the queue, his eyes filled with admiration. The other party perfectly matched the colonel's definition and image of an excellent soldier. Wait a little longer. We still have time. Dr. Erskine, who was standing nearby, answered. His gaze wasn't fixed on Luke, but rather on Rogers, who stood out conspicuously in the queue. If a super soldier were to choose a strong, big guy. Therefore, Erskine had absolutely no need to conduct this secret selection. They can just pick one from the army. The world has never lacked excellent soldiers who know how to obey orders and have strong muscles. However, finding a truly good person, a super soldier who possesses power but does not bully the weak, is extremely difficult. Erskine knew he didn't have more time to patiently select and carefully explore. Therefore, he could only place his hopes on Rogers. That thin, short man possessed a rare quality that touched people's hearts. You made me investigate Rogers' background. Yes, he is indeed a good guy. But so what? What would the committee's bureaucrats think if they knew that the super soldier candidate was a skinny little guy who was out of breath even when running? Colonel Phillips said with dissatisfaction. In his view, war is a contest of strength between the two sides, not of the soldier's character. The selection process isn't over yet, and the time isn't up. Colonel, let's wait patiently a little longer. Dr. Erskine gave the same answer. This time, however, his gaze shifted to Luke. Chapter 9. General Patton once said, war depends on weapons, but victory depends on soldiers. We are confident we will win this battle because we have the best soldiers. The Strategic Scientific Legion is composed of allied nations. The elites of the free world have gathered here. Our goal is to build the most powerful army in history. And every army has one leader. We'll choose that person after this week. He will be the first super soldier. Similarly, he will personally send Adolf Hitler to hell. After 2 weeks of basic training, Colonel Phillips finally revealed the super soldier selection plan. He held Carter's score sheet in his hand and looked at the tall and imposing Luke. This young man from Brooklyn continues to perform exceptionally well. Judging from his physical fitness and overall performance in various training programs, he is undoubtedly the number one among the new recruits at the Caspian Sea training camp. This is the kind of super soldier the country needs. Colonel Phillips thought with satisfaction. Then, he inadvertently noticed the thin and short Rogers and sighed helplessly. Despite the fact that the opponent trained diligently and never slacked off. However, his naturally weak physique made it difficult for him to even become a qualified soldier. I really don't know what Erskine is thinking. Colonel Phillips was somewhat annoyed. He was under pressure from the committee and also under scrutiny from the White House. If a super soldier fails to satisfy the military, then his career is essentially over. It's important to understand that countries invest significant human and material resources in establishing strategic scientific legions. Now, everyone is waiting for the results. Super soldier. After the speech, the group dispersed. Many of the new recruits had burning eyes and were muttering the same word to themselves. Boss Luke. Your performance was the best among all the recruits, you truly deserve the title of super soldier. Back at the barracks, Gilmer Hodge, who had been reprimanded by Carter, spoke in a fawning tone. In the original storyline, he was a minor, villainous character. He often bullied the slender Rogers because of his big size and strong fists. However, things changed after Luke arrived. Hodge, who sought satisfaction by bullying the weak, suffered his first major setback. On his first night at the Caspian training camp, Hodge, playing the villain, planned to make fun of Rogers, but Luke ended up shoving his head down the toilet. His fists, which he considered strong enough, were like a lamb to the slaughter when they met Luke, a man with a wealth of life experience who had beaten up thugs, slashed gangsters, and cleaned houses. He was completely powerless against him. From then on, no one among the new recruits dared to mess with the Brooklyn duo. As for Hodge, who was stuffed into the toilet, he became Luke's loyal lackey. They fawn over him every day, calling him boss, like a lapdog. Luke once suspected that this guy might have masochistic tendencies, or that his head got wet when it was shoved into the toilet. However, I later realized that bullies like Hodge, who prey on the weak and fear the strong, often subscribe to the simplistic belief that might makes right. Therefore, it's normal for them to behave this way. In short, Luke seemed to have unlocked the potential of a top-tier soldier, effortlessly dominating the entire Caspian Sea training camp. Colonel Phillips not only praised him highly, but he was also surrounded by a large entourage wherever he went in the military camp. Use your brain. If the criteria for selecting super soldiers are training performance and strong muscles, then why doesn't the military just select them directly from the ranks? Luke didn't give Hodge a friendly look. After all, a simp gets nothing. Yes, boss, Luke is right. Hodge put on a smile as he cleaned the barracks. Steve, don't be discouraged. I think Dr. Erskine has high hopes for you. After dismissing Hodge, who had been trying to curry favor with him, Luke walked up to Rogers. The future Captain America was somewhat frustrated at this moment. Seeing Luke's outstanding performance and reflecting on his own poor results, he couldn't help but feel somewhat frustrated. I never thought of becoming a super soldier, but I've started to doubt whether choosing to serve in the military was the right decision. Maybe Bucky is right, if there are things you're destined not to do, giving up also takes courage. Rogers seemed to have hit rock bottom, his tone filled with uncertainty. Through these days of training, he finally realized how weak he was. I don't think so. Dr. Erskine chose you and drafted you because he must have discovered some excellent quality in you that's worth cultivating. Confidence is the secret to success, don't let temporary setbacks defeat you. Golden character is more valuable than strong muscles. Luke served Rogers a bowl of steaming chicken soup for the soul, which made Rogers' eyes light up and his fighting spirit soar. If he had continued his efforts and uttered more inspirational quotes for future generations, perhaps Captain America would have regarded him as a spiritual mentor. So, you can still learn something from reading more marketing articles. Seeing Rogers' mood return to its energetic state, Luke breathed a sigh of relief. After all, Captain America was an important part of his plan. During the 2-week basic training, Luke made no attempt to hide his abilities and achieved excellent results. Naturally, it's to obtain the super soldier serum. Only, he has no intention of wearing the Stars and Stripes uniform and taking over Captain America's position. Even if you become a super soldier, you'll still end up being used as a mascot by politicians. I don't want to perform on stage and debut as an idol. Luke's thinking is very clear. The military is researching a super soldier serum. The real purpose was to build an invincible and powerful legion. This would allow them to advance unimpeded, storm Berlin, and end the war. As per the original storyline, Dr. Erskine was eventually assassinated, the only specimen was destroyed, and the formula for the super soldier serum was lost. Rogers, as the only super soldier, is far less useful on the battlefield than as a mascot to promote national bonds. That's what those politicians think. If Luke replaced Rogers and wore the Stars and Stripes uniform, his fate would probably be similar. What if we had done it differently, and saved Dr. Erskine? Next, super soldiers will be mass-produced. Luke will still have no future, because he is no longer the special one. Therefore, after repeated consideration, Luke decided to showcase his best qualities to win over Colonel Phillips and put more pressure on Dr. Erskine. If there were 2 suitable candidates, the story might have unfolded differently. As darkness fell, Erskine found Luke resting. The German scientist stated his purpose directly. Colonel Phillips thinks you're the best candidate for super soldier, Luke. What do you think? Feeling that scrutinizing gaze, Luke remained calm, his heartbeat steady. The qualities of a super soldier shouldn't be a strong physique. They should be compassion and a sense of awe. Luke answered without hesitation. He could tell that Dr. Erskine was testing him. Rogers remained the most suitable candidate in their eyes. The German scientist developed psychological trauma after the Red Skull incident. No matter how well Luke performed, it couldn't move Erskine as much as Rogers' words at the recruiting station. So, who in the training camp do you think meets these criteria? Erskine adjusted his glasses and asked hesitantly. My friend. Steve Rogers. His character is completely trustworthy. Luke's eyes were resolute, as if that was truly what he thought. Upon hearing this satisfactory answer, the last trace of doubt in Erskine's eyes vanished without a trace. He was initially wary of Luke's involvement with the mob and the possibility that his hands were stained with blood. They fear that once the other becomes a super soldier, he will completely lose his humanity, just like Red Skull. That is the effect of serum. Good people get better, bad people get worse. Very good. Erskine patted Luke on the shoulder forcefully, smiling approvingly. He and Colonel Phillips originally had completely different ideas, and neither could convince the other. Luke's answer completely dispelled Erskine's doubts. He said with a solemn expression, "You two will both be super soldiers." Chapter 10. A week later, Luke and Rogers left the Caspian Sea training camp and got into a car bound for New York. As for the new recruits undergoing training, they are in the reserves. If the serum injection is successful, everyone has the chance to become a super soldier. I never imagined that, after all this time, I'd still be back in Brooklyn. Rogers remarked. He sat next to Luke, his gaze passing through the car window as he watched the familiar buildings recede into the distance. So the colonel was right after all, good fortune always favors fools. Luke joked. When Rogers learned that he had been chosen as a test subject for the super soldier experiment, he couldn't wait to find him to share the news, only to find Colonel Phillips in the barracks. The latter glanced at Rogers with a look of disdain and said the above sentence. This isn't just good luck. I owe it all to you and Dr. Erskine. Without your help, I couldn't have gotten this far. Rogers said earnestly. He heard from Colonel Phillips that Luke had recommended himself to Dr. Erskine. Although Rogers was not good at expressing his emotions, he kept his gratitude to himself. If you were a woman, I might accept this gratitude. Luke made a disgusted face and joked, see that block, that alley, and that parking lot behind it. These places used to be your battlegrounds. Rogers lowered his head and gave an awkward smile. Because he couldn't shake his habit of meddling in other people's business, he was beaten many times. The battlefield that Luke mentioned was actually the place where he had been beaten up before. Why didn't you run away? Carter, who was driving in the front, spoke up. She was part of the entourage and was responsible for safely bringing Luke and Rogers to their destination. If you run once, you'll keep running. If you stand up and fight back, one day you'll have a chance to defeat them. Rogers spoke his heartfelt feelings, and his sincere tone moved Carter. Dr. Erskine's choice of the other party was not without reason, at the very least, his courage deserves praise. I often experience being looked down upon in a certain field. Carter seemed to have his emotions stirred, and unusually, he said a few more words. During her time at the Caspian Sea training camp, this female officer was like an iceberg, making people afraid to approach her. Even Howard Stark, a renowned Casanova, has suffered repeated setbacks and hasn't even managed to invite anyone out for dinner yet. Miss Carter, I don't understand why you want to join the army. You're a beautiful lady. Rogers glanced at Carter and began his incredibly tactless, straight man-like speech, knowing that what she hated most was being told she was too pretty to be a secret agent. Carter was a strong-willed man who never believed that his abilities were inferior to those of any man. Seeing that Rogers was about to anger his future girlfriend, Luke quickly tried to smooth things over, asking, "How much longer until we arrive?" "Soon." Carter gave Rogers a cold glance, snorted, and said nothing more. The latter looked completely innocent, having no idea what he had said wrong. "Rogers, your flirting skills are the worst I've ever seen." Luke shook his head and said in a low voice. The rest of the drive was quiet inside the car. They arrived at their destination in about 20 minutes. The three of them got out of the car and pushed open the door of the antique shop. "That's right, this is the secret base of the Strategic Science Legion." Carter exchanged a secret code with an old woman, then led Luke and Rogers into the inner room. What a cliched design! Looking at the shelves piled high with books, which opened to both sides, Luke couldn't help but feel the urge to complain. Inside the base, each door was guarded by fully armed soldiers. Every now and then, researchers in white coats would walk by carrying documents. Rogers, who was seeing such a scene for the first time, was a little nervous. He looked at Luke, who was walking beside him. The other person's expression was calm and composed. As expected of Luke. Rogers thought to himself. In reality, Luke's true emotions were far from as calm as they appeared. From Brooklyn, he walked step by step to the secret base of the Strategic Scientific Corps, about to receive the serum injection. This is not an easy task. I'd go to any lengths for this cheat. The three went down to the bottom floor and saw two metal instruments in the center, where Dr. Erskine and Howard Stark were talking. Colonel Phillips and the attending senators remained in the control room on the second floor. Everyone was filled with anticipation, eager to witness a miracle. "Let's begin." Dr. Erskine addressed the two of them. Luke and Rogers exchanged a glance, took off their boat-shaped hats, and removed their coats. The difference in their physiques is striking. The former could be described as strong and powerful with well-defined features, while the latter was as thin as firewood. The researchers around him shook their heads and sighed, doubting whether Rogers could withstand the serum injections. "It's okay, you can do it." Luke placed a hand on Rogers' shoulder, as if to instill courage in him. If it weren't for Captain America, he really would have debuted as an idol and been selling government bonds. Seeing Rogers nod in agreement, Luke turned his gaze to the metal instrument in front of him, its sides covered with complex wires and cables. The one in charge of operating the machine was Howard Stark, who sported a small mustache. The other party is at the control panel, busy preparing for the injection of serum. This brilliant scientist, who used patriotism as a pretext to cultivate relationships with high-ranking military officials, was also one of the participants in this project. Click! A bright light. Staff from the military's propaganda department took a photo of Luke and Rogers standing together. This is a historic moment worth commemorating. It's about to begin. Erskine cleared out the unauthorized personnel, leaving only Howard Stark and the other researchers. "You will both succeed," the doctor said earnestly. He originally intended to select only one person to create a super soldier. However, Luke's outstanding performance and sincere attitude shook Erskine's original idea. So he and Colonel Phillips each compromised. The decision was made to inject both of them with the serum, turning them into super soldiers. In the latter's words, it means at least one will succeed. It begins with a series of minimally invasive injections, injecting serum into the muscle tissue. This step triggers dramatic changes in the cells. Dr. Erskine patiently explained the process, and then the outer casings of the two metal instruments placed together slowly closed. Luke was plunged into complete darkness, unable to see a single ray of light from the outside world, only able to hear Dr. Erskine and Howard Stark talking. The cold needle pierced the skin, and the serum was steadily injected into the body, merging with countless cells. "I don't seem to feel anything." Luke had been somewhat worried that the process of injecting the super soldier serum would be extremely painful. At least in his memory, Rogers shouted, himself hoarse and almost died. "Start the instrument." Luke heard Dr. Erskine's voice. "Metal instruments connected to the cable are subjected to a strong, hissing current." A burst of white light erupted. "FK." Luke instantly felt a tearing pain, as if his muscle fibers were being pulled into countless strands. He felt like he was torn to pieces. Not only physical stimulation, but also mental stimulation is equally unbearable. However, the intense pain, enough to drive someone mad, lasted only a fleeting moment. Then, as if absorbed, it disappeared. 100%. The data appeared clearly on my retina. The progress bar, which had been stuck for a long time, finally finished loading. Player identity detected. Gift packs being distributed. Distributed successfully. Please check your inbox. Lines of information flowed out. Immediately afterwards, a faint white light appeared. A massive data stream, refreshing like a waterfall, forms a character panel. Host, Luke Cavill. Load template, none. Ability, none. Reputation, none. Task list, not yet available. Luke was completely bewildered. So all that hard work just resulted in a blank control panel? Forget it, let's open a gift pack first. Luke, familiar with the process, opened the consciousness space. Start? With a slight thought, a burst of golden light erupted. Numerous characters flooded my mind. Golden Superman. Silver Superman. Mechanical Superman. Quantum Superman. Superpower. Supreme Little Superman. Various Superman templates were displayed before Luke's eyes. Superman template detected, load. Yes. Should it cover the skin? No. Loading successful. Luke reopened the character panel. Host, Luke Cavill. Load template, Superman, LV1. Abilities, Stellar Energy, passive, Biofield, passive. Reputation, none. Task list, not yet available. Then, lines of specific information representing bodily data flooded into the brain like a tidal wave. Chapter 11. A few minutes ago. In the control room, Colonel Phillips was exchanging pleasantries with one of the committee members, Congressman Brand. "I'm very pleased that you could come, Mr. Congressman," the colonel said with a smile. Given his temperament, he wouldn't normally want to deal with politicians. Because these guys are too hypocritical. Always wearing a smile, but secretly calculating the benefits of each decision. This made Colonel Phillips, a soldier by training and someone who valued the big picture, very uncomfortable. But as the administrator of the Strategic Scientific Corps and a participant in the Super Soldier program, he had to learn to deal with politicians. After all, research funding and allocated resources require committee approval. "That's the super soldier you chose? My God! He looks like he hasn't eaten in days." Senator Brand stood in the control room on the second floor, looking down. He looked surprised to see the short and thin Rogers. This is somewhat different from the super soldiers the committee wanted. Rogers is a backup in case of failure. "Congressman, have you seen him, Luke Cavill? He's the best soldier I've ever seen." Colonel Phillips looked embarrassed and pointed to Luke below. He didn't think highly of Rogers. The fact that Rogers was even here was simply a result of Dr. Erskine's stubbornness. Many people are applying for funding at this stage, but the budget allocated to the Strategic Scientific Corps is always the largest. "Colonel, don't let the president down." Congressman Brand made a remark and sat down with his accompanying publicity staff. His willingness to attend was not out of a love for science. Instead, they wanted to claim the credit immediately. Senator Brand astutely recognized the propaganda value inherent in the super soldier. Whether it can change the course of the war is not important, attracting public attention is the key. 5 minutes later, the serum injection experiment reached its final stage. The power switches on the two metal instruments were already turned to 70%. The dazzling white light almost engulfed the surrounding space. A scream filled with intense pain emanated from inside the metal instrument. "That's Rogers." The process of injecting serum felt to him like 1,000 knives, brutally cutting into every cell and nerve in his body. Especially as the energy transfer value increases, the transformation required becomes more intense, resulting in greater physical and mental suffering. "Steve." Erskine's right hand trembled. Everyone knew that injecting the serum might cause the test subject's death. Only the one who successfully survives can become a super soldier. But it seems Rogers can't take it anymore. "Colonel, what's going on?" I asked, tilting my head. Senator Brand asked. Two identical metal instruments, and the same test subject receiving serum injections. Why is Rogers acting so distressed, while Luke shows no reaction at all? Could it be that he injected fake serum? In response to Senator Brand's question, Colonel Phillips shrugged, revealing the same puzzled expression. "Subsequent templates require reputation to unlock, isn't that just like when I play games?" Lying in the metal instrument, Luke was unaware of the changes happening outside. He processed the massive amount of information his brain received and began to understand how to use the so-called templates. First, there's the level setting shown in the character panel. The game divides Kryptonians into 6 tiers based on their social class. LV1, Commoner. LV2, Warrior. LV3, Scientist. LV4, General. LV5, Consul. LV6, Emperor. Each upgrade allows you to draw exclusive items for Kryptonians. For example, key items such as the Fortress of Solitude and the Codex of Life. The Superman template I currently possess is that of a commoner, and in terms of both overall qualities and abilities, it's currently inferior to the official Superman from next door. Luke looked at the numerous templates that were grayed out and unlocked, feeling somewhat disappointed. The cheat he received was essentially a game control panel. Therefore, the setup still follows the same pattern of grinding reputation, leveling up, and completing daily tasks. Clark Kent is a naturally occurring Kryptonian with limitless potential. As for General Zod, also a Kryptonian, he was born a general, his level is estimated to be LV4 or LV5. Luke's thoughts wandered, and he thought of 2 Kryptonians who had left a deep impression on him. Although he is currently only at the lowest rank of LV1 Commoner, it is enough for him. Those with Kryptonian lineage are essentially giant power banks. As long as they absorb the stellar energy of the yellow sun, their physical abilities will continuously improve. However, to possess unlimited potential like a real Superman, then you'll have to work hard to grind reputation, level up, and increase the cap. Otherwise, turning into a golden superhero simply by sunbathing is completely unrealistic. 100%. The metal instrument was turned up to its maximum power, and the blinding white light almost burned my eyes. A burst of sparks erupted from the control panel, and Rogers, who had been screaming in pain, suddenly fell silent. Erskine quickly told Howard Stark to turn on the metal instruments. He couldn't worry about Luke who hadn't made a sound yet, he had to get Rogers out of there first. A puff of white steam dissipated, and everyone wore expressions of disbelief and shock. Steve Rogers. That skinny little guy has transformed into a tall, imposing captain with a huge chest. It's like he's become a completely different person. The next moment, everyone in the control room cheered and jumped for joy, overjoyed and wishing they could throw a celebration party immediately. Member of Parliament Brand was filled with ambition, shouting things like Berlin should be on edge and capture Hitler alive. In his view, with a super soldier legion like Rogers, the Allies would have a sure win and could win the war without any doubt. However, Colonel Phillips and Senator Brand, caught up in their excitement, failed to notice that their entourage in the control room had taken advantage of everyone's inattention to approach Dr. Erskine. Long live Hydra! One of the accompanying staff members who came to offer their congratulations quietly approached Dr. Erskine and whispered the following words in his ear. The latter looked up in surprise, only to see a pair of cold eyes. Hydra? Dr. Erskine immediately realized what was happening. The accompanying man didn't give him time to call for help. A PPK automatic pistol was pressed against his chest, and the trigger was pulled immediately. The bullet pierced the heart, drawing a spray of blood. Dr. Erskine felt a momentary pain, then collapsed helplessly. Gunshots echoed inside, accompanied by shouts of "Protect the counselor," and the guards moved closer. Immediately afterwards, a loud booming sound came from the control room. The explosion sent flames billowing out. The powerful shockwave shattered the glass windows. Colonel Phillips shielded the panicked congressman, while the guards were caught in the blast wave and slammed against the wall like kites with broken strings. Screams, explosions, gunshots. These noises interrupted Luke's vision of the future. He frowned slightly, pondered for a moment, and easily freed himself from the restraints that bound him tightly, a necessary measure to prevent the test subject from moving around and harming himself. Creak! Creak! Luke punched through the sturdy metal casing of the instrument, ignoring the crackling electrical sparks, and with a powerful effort, ripped open the layer of alloy metal. With a sickening tearing sound, Luke jumped out of the metal device the next moment. He saw Dr. Erskine lying on the ground, shot, and Rogers, who had grown taller and stronger. Senator Brand shrank back, hiding to the side under the cover of the crowd. The man in the suit, who appeared to be a Hydra assassin, shot down several guards, ran up the stairs, and disappeared from sight. Chapter 12. You stay here. Protect the colonel. I'm going after him. Luke jumped out of the metal instrument, looked around, and immediately realized what had happened. He casually draped his coat over his shoulders and told Rogers to stay at the base, to which the latter nodded instinctively. Everyone watched as Luke bent his knees slightly and leaped. Load the Superman template, a completely new body. Like a cannonball that has been charged up, it bounced directly from the ground floor of the control room to the second floor. With one hand gripping the railing, Luke executed a clean and nimble flip, landing firmly on the ground. Fortunately, the data-driven capabilities provided by the character panel allowed him to quickly adapt to his physical abilities, which far exceeded those of ordinary people. Unlike Clark in his childhood, who frequently faced the trouble of losing control of his abilities, Luke exerted force with his feet, and a surge of power erupted from his body, causing spider-web-like cracks to appear on the concrete floor. He was like a whirlwind that swept through, stirring up a violent gust of air. With a loud thud, the ground seemed to tremble. He darted out like a sharp sword, leaving a trail of afterimages. In just 2 breaths, that tall figure had already rushed into the corridor. That assassin sent by Hydra was quite clever. While escaping, they didn't forget to destroy the button-controlled door, trapping their pursuers inside and delaying them. Unfortunately, in my eyes, it's as thin as a piece of paper. Luke neither stopped nor slowed down. The figure, rushing straight ahead, suddenly accelerated and smashed open the thick metal door. With a loud bang, a clear human figure appeared on the door. Okay. I take back what I just said, I did have some feelings about it. Luke shook his head. He admitted that the metal door wasn't as fragile as paper, it was probably more like a thick wooden plank. They rushed out of the secret base and entered the cubicle. Luke abruptly stopped, stirring up a gust of wind that made the bookshelf sway and shake. He stepped outside and saw the old woman from the antique shop, who had been his contact, lying on the ground, shot twice. Outside the door, a black sedan had already started. The assassin sent by Hydra was wielding a Thompson submachine gun and indiscriminately sweeping through the area. Da-da-da! A hail of bullets shattered the car windows, sweeping across several plainclothes agents waiting outside. The sudden and intense gunfight caused panic among pedestrians. Fearing being caught in the crossfire, they covered their heads and fled, screaming at the top of their lungs. Luke strode out of the antique shop, ready to give chase, when the car parked at the entrance suddenly exploded. Amidst the raging flames and astonishing shockwaves, its towering figure stood firm, unwavering in the slightest. They watched as the car carrying the Hydra assassins turned a corner and disappeared at the end of the street. Luke gave a cold laugh and took off running. "Why did you cause such a commotion?" the Hydra member who came to meet them asked, sounding like he was complaining. Their mission was to assassinate Abraham Erskine and sabotage the super soldier program, not to plan a terrorist attack in New York. Because if things escalate, it will come at a huge cost to evacuate. 2 super soldiers. Chasers behind. Drive fast. The assassin was panting heavily, a cold sweat breaking out on his back, as if he were being watched closely by a ferocious beast. Even after getting into the waiting car and shaking off the plainclothes agents, I still didn't feel like I had escaped. He was a spy that Hydra had spent a great deal of time and effort planting in the military committee. If it weren't for orders from Berlin to eliminate Abraham Erskine, I would never have willingly exposed myself. On the main battlefields between the Allied and Axis powers, the contest was about the abilities of soldiers, guns, and leaders. However, in the intelligence contest, it comes down to deciphering secret radio communications and the time and depth of spies' infiltration. This assassin named Greg was arguably the longest-serving and highest-level spies that Hydra had infiltrated in New York. He could have played a more important role, but now he doesn't have the chance. Upon returning to Berlin, the Führer will surely award you the medal personally. The Hydra member driving the car said enviously. If I could get back to Berlin, then wait. There are people behind me. Just as the assassin Greg was about to say that he was going back to his hometown to get married after completing this mission, he caught a glimpse of a tall figure rushing towards him in the rearview mirror out of the corner of his eye. The Hydra members, who thought they had escaped safely, stared wide-eyed, their faces filled with disbelief. "I kept my foot on the gas the whole time," he murmured. "Is there anyone in this world who can catch up with a 4-wheeled car on 2 legs? The assassin, Greg, immediately raised his gun, leaned out of the car window, and tried to return fire. Luke suddenly leaped high into the air, dodging the machine gun fire, and landed accurately on the speeding car. Then, using both hands, as if tearing paper, he ripped open the metal roof of the car. Greg, sitting in the passenger seat, threw away the empty magazine of his submachine gun, pulled out his pistol, aimed it at Luke, and was about to pull the trigger. Luke remained expressionless, extending his right hand to grasp the PPK automatic pistol. With a thud, the 7.65 mm bullet struck the open palm, but it sounded like it had hit a steel plate, producing a metallic clanging sound. Luke raised an eyebrow, squeezed hard, and crushed the pistol into a lump of scrap metal. "Monster!" The driver, his face filled with terror, screamed. As a result, Luke complained that he was too noisy, picked him up with one hand, and threw him away like trash. Whoosh! He smashed through the window of a shop on the street, collapsed to the ground, and his fate is unknown. Cut off one head, and 2 will grow back. Long live Hydra! Seeing the terrifying power Luke possessed, Greg felt a pang of despair. After shouting the Hydra slogan, he prepared to crush the potassium cyanide poison hidden in his teeth. He was prepared to sacrifice himself for the organization and was not afraid of death. "I know you're with Hydra, how could I not have thought of that?" Luke curled his lip, as if he had expected it, and reached out to dislocate the other person's jaw. In his eyes, the other party's movements were too slow. As long as he concentrated, it was like watching a series of still frames of a film. Hydra is a large, tightly controlled organization. Every spy and agent sent out on a mission would smear poison on their collar or hide it in their hollowed-out dentures to prevent being caught or discovered and causing an intelligence leak. The Strategic Science Legion was aware of this information. Ignoring Greg's terrified gaze, Luke lifted him out of the car like a chick. A few minutes later, Rogers and Carter arrived by car. They took the captured assassin and the driver back to the antique shop in Brooklyn. "Well done, Luke." Back at the secret base, Colonel Phillips praised. He saw the human silhouette Luke left on the wall, and heard about the amazing feat of Luke outrunning a car on his legs and stopping a bullet with his hands. Looking at Luke, who was now taller and stronger than before, the colonel seemed to have made a decision. "You all go out first. I need to talk to Cavill about something." Colonel Phillips glanced at the chaotic medical room and called out loudly. He dismissed the doctor and nurses, then looked at Luke with a grave expression. "Is there something you need, Colonel?" Luke donned the jacket, becoming one of only 2 super soldiers. Like Rogers, he also had to have his blood drawn. Dr. Erskine was shot and killed, and all the samples had already been used up, which would not have happened otherwise. The original plan was for only 1 super soldier, but now Luke has joined the team, which has resulted in the use of the remaining serum samples. Even with a wealth of research data to support it, it is still impossible to reverse engineer Dr. Erskine's serum formula. Currently, this remains a difficult task to complete. The only hope now lies in the blood of Luke and Rogers. The hope of creating a replicative serum lies hidden in their genetic code. However, the military's illusions were ultimately fragile bubbles. First of all, Luke is not a true super soldier at all. The energy provided by the serum was used to activate cheat codes and open gift packs, without having any effect on modifying the human body whatsoever. This is why Luke experienced virtually no pain after the injection. Moreover, he loaded the Superman template. Trying to extract anything from blood is undoubtedly a pipe dream. Even decades later, the military, through so-called reverse engineering, produced a bunch of substandard products with extremely serious side effects. Have you thought about your future, Luke? Colonel Phillips, his expression grave, said in a deep voice, "Copying the serum formula and creating new super soldiers is impossible in the short term. If the plan fails, those politicians will do everything they can to shirk responsibility. As fellow super soldiers, I have a higher opinion of you. Rogers is a good guy. But you excel in every aspect. I can see it, Luke, you're a born warrior. You'll never show mercy to your enemies. In this respect, Rogers is far from adequate. He still harbors a certain naive idealism. This is of no help in winning the war. The essence of war is plunder. It's violence. It's a means of seizing profits. Although we may call it a just war. A war for freedom. But war itself has no inherent good or evil. Rogers doesn't understand this principle, but I hope you can." Hearing this, Luke was greatly surprised. He hadn't expected the colonel to be so perceptive. The other party's behavior in the storyline is simply that of a typical, stubborn, and stereotypical soldier. Chapter 13. What guidance did the colonel offer me? Keenly sensing Colonel Phillips's subtle hint of wanting to cultivate him, Luke promptly adopted a humble attitude of seeking advice. "Those politicians on the committee are untrustworthy. They're a bunch of damn bastards. That Hydra assassin got in here entirely thanks to Senator Brand, and now he wants to shift the blame onto us." Colonel Phillips initially launched into a tirade, but his dissatisfaction lessened somewhat upon seeing Luke's humble and receptive attitude. The older generation always wants to nurture and promote ambitious and capable young talents provided that you can demonstrate value commensurate with them. In Colonel Phillips' view, Luke was one of those young talents worth cultivating. That's why he spoke so many heartfelt words. Politicians only care about their own interests, they can be bought off, and they might even do things detrimental to the country. The Super Soldier program is facing failure, and figuring out how to best utilize your and Rogers' abilities has become a problem. Colonel Phillips, who has served in the military for over 20 years, is very knowledgeable about the ins and outs of politics. The president wanted an army, but all he got were 2 super soldiers. The capabilities of an individual on the battlefield are infinitely diminished. Even if you can punch through a steel plate and catch up with a speeding car, you can't withstand artillery fire, nor can you fly to Berlin and drag Hitler out of his house. Luke, who had been listening quietly, had a slight flicker in his eyes. If given time, he really could do all of that. In less than 24 hours since the template was loaded, the increase from the stellar energy has already exceeded the total amount of training over the years. Luke could clearly feel the trillions of cells in his body thirstily absorbing the sunlight. So much research funding poured in, and all you've gained are 2 strong soldiers. To be honest, the military is very disappointed and has lost interest in you. Barring any unforeseen circumstances, your fate will likely be to stay in the lab, having your blood drawn, and acting as guinea pigs. Colonel Phillips paused, then changed the subject, but I don't think so. Seeing your performance just now, and your excellent results at the Caspian Sea training camp, Luke, I've decided to entrust you with an even more important task. Do you know the Roaring Commando? It's a special operations team under the Scientific Strategic Legion, composed of the elite soldiers. I want you to lead this team and become their commander. Luke looked surprised. This was a genuine emotional reaction. He hadn't expected Colonel Phillips to arrange things this way for him. Leading the Roaring Commando? Commander? I wonder if we'll get to see Wolverine Logan. Luke's thinking is divergent. He remembered that in a certain comic book, Wolverine was also a member of this team and had even fought alongside Captain America. Perhaps, some dark-colored marinated egg will be there too. After all, Nick Fury had experience joining the Howling Commandos in his early years. What about Rogers? Luke asked curiously. As the saying goes, with great power comes great responsibility. It remains to be seen whether Rogers will once again become an icon in the hearts of Americans. Congressman Rogers Brand is quite interested in him and intends to make him an ambassador for promoting government bonds. Colonel Phillips shrugged, indicating his own helplessness. He originally intended to recruit both super soldiers into the Howling Commandos to complete a certain plan of the Strategic Scientific Legion. But Senator Brand refused to budge. He was drawn to the super soldier gimmick. The goal is to make either Luke or Rogers a household name. In this way, he can both promote government bonds and enhance his political achievements, and also campaign for his future election campaign. That's the best of both worlds. So that's how it is. Luke secretly felt lucky. Without Rogers to shield him, he might have to put on a costume, go on stage, and take on the role of a salesman. Even if we manage to get back into the military's sights through other means, we'll have missed many opportunities. For example, right now. Side quest, Roaring Commando, the first step to becoming a war hero. Requirements: join the group and gain the approval of at least 3 team members. Reward: Scarecrow's Fear Gas X10. The task list is now open. Luke glanced at his character panel and saw a side quest appear. To be transported to the Marvel Universe and receive props from the neighboring film set as a reward feels weird. Seeing Colonel Phillips's gaze, Luke composed himself and said in a deep voice, "I'm willing to lead the Howling Commandos." The former was very satisfied with this answer. "Don't let me down, Luke." The colonel patted Luke on the shoulder with delight, then turned and walked out of the infirmary. "I received a phone call from President Roosevelt this morning. From now on, the Strategic Scientific Corps has a new mission. We must fight Hydra to the death. We must utterly annihilate this terrifying monster lurking in the shadows during this war." The following morning, Colonel Phillips delivered a passionate speech. Researchers, agents, and spies alike began packing their belongings, preparing to relocate. They were about to leave New York to follow orders from their superiors and head to the front lines in London. The Super Soldier Project has failed, and the Strategic Science Legion, which originally carried great expectations, has seen its status plummet instantly. Rogers stood in the base's main hall, his eyes blank, like an outsider. He didn't know what to do, and no one told him what to do. Miss Carter and Howard Stark both have their own missions. Except for yourself, Colonel. If you're going to fight Hydra, I'd like to join you. Rogers mustered his courage and walked up to Colonel Phillips. Rogers harbored a deep hatred for the murderer of Dr. Erskine. "You are now military property, I have no authority to decide your whereabouts." Colonel Phillips shook his head. He can only choose one of the two super soldiers. The rest belong to Senator Brand. Phillips hated making these kinds of deals, but he had to. The assassination of Dr. Erskine and the failure of the super soldier program. This series of unexpected events signifies that all the research funding invested by the military has been wasted, yielding no return whatsoever. As the manager of the Strategic Scientific Corps, Phillips bears the brunt of the pressure. Even though much of the blame lies with Senator Brand, it is because one of his entourage was a Hydra assassin. However, as is well known, this powerful senator has always been nicknamed Non-Stick Pan. Phillips didn't know how the other party defended themselves, but in the end, the committee's accountability only fell on him. In order to preserve the strength of the Strategic Science Legion, a portion of the allocated resources will be retained. Phillips had no choice but to make a deal with Senator Brand, handing Rogers over to him. At least that was better than him being a guinea pig in a lab. "The serum worked, Colonel. I can go to the battlefield." Rogers tried to seize the opportunity, but Colonel Phillips interrupted him, saying, "Congressman Brand says there's a better battlefield for you." Having said that, he turned and left. "The Colonel is under a lot of pressure too, don't be discouraged." Seeing Rogers' dejected expression, Carter, who was standing next to him, offered words of comfort. She held the experimental records in her arms, her eyes filled with sympathy. Through human modification, the originally thin and short man has grown to over 6 feet, 188 centimeters, almost as tall as Luke. Moreover, Rogers' muscles were more muscular, like a bodybuilder. Luke, also a super soldier, is not quite as exaggerated. Where is Luke? Where is he? Rogers suddenly remembered that he hadn't seen Luke since yesterday. "I don't know," the colonel said. "He had other tasks." Carter shook his head. Chapter 14. Just as the Strategic Scientific Corps embarked on its journey to London, and Rogers was recruited by senators to serve as a sales ambassador for national bonds, Luke remained in Brooklyn, New York. As Carter said, he had other tasks. After that conversation in the infirmary, Colonel Phillips told Luke about a shocking plan with a very high level of secrecy. Even with a super soldier leading the team, the difficulty level is still very high. Colonel Phillips entrusted the Howling Commandos to Luke not simply because he valued Luke's abilities. As one of only 2 super soldiers in the world, no one is more suitable than Luke to carry out that plan. In other words, the colonel needs him. That's why the idea of cultivating it came to mind. Luke himself was not surprised by this. This is one of the reasons why he didn't hide his outstanding performance at the Caspian training camp. Interpersonal interactions in society are essentially an exchange of interests between individuals. Being able to be used by others is, in a sense, a manifestation of value. There's a line from an internet meme from my past life that goes, "Since I became a useless piece of trash, no one can use me anymore." While it's funny, upon closer reflection, it actually makes a lot of sense. With the failure of the super soldier program, the Strategic Scientific Corps' status has clearly declined. Funding was cut, personnel were reassigned, from the rear to the front lines. All these actions indicate that Colonel Phillips must find a way to demonstrate the necessity of the Strategic Scientific Corps' existence. Therefore, it will likely face being shut down. This is not an exaggeration. During wartime, the allocation of all resources should prioritize value and efficiency. So, in order to salvage the Strategic Scientific Legion's status, the colonel put me in charge of the Howling Commando? I thought my charisma was strong enough to win over any character in the storyline. Luke lay on the large bed in the hotel, gazing at the crisp military uniform hanging on the coat rack. "Captain Cavil." He muttered something to himself, a smile spreading across his face. This was one of the benefits offered by Colonel Phillips, and also to facilitate the leadership of the Howling Commandos. Otherwise, who would be willing to accept a new recruit as their superior? Luke rose from a private to a lieutenant in less than a month. The speed was astonishing. If I really accomplish the task Colonel Phillips assigned me, it's not impossible that I'll become not just a captain, but perhaps the fastest rising field grade officer in history. If I'm ambitious enough, I might even follow in Eisenhower's footsteps and move into the White House. Luke's thoughts continued to wander, sketching out a beautiful blueprint for the future. A moment later, he couldn't help but laugh out loud, saying self-deprecatingly, "Seems like I'm thinking a bit too far ahead." The young man, promoted to captain and about to lead the Howling Commandos, shook off unnecessary distractions and returned to the question of his own abilities. "I'm Superman now, albeit a low-spec version." Luke opened the character panel and looked at the data displayed on it. The power he possesses is roughly the same as Superman's when he was first introduced. It can run faster than a car at full speed, punch through thick steel plates, and its dynamic vision can easily detect the trajectory of bullets. His muscle density, far exceeding that of ordinary people, makes it difficult for small-caliber bullets and melee weapons to cause fatal damage to Luke. It can be described as having an impenetrable body of steel, not considering heavy firepower. The superhuman template for a level 1 civilian is roughly that their physical abilities can be evolved to the point where they can catch bullets with their bare hands or block artillery shells with their bare bodies. Luke pondered. He wanted to unlock flight and heat vision, which required the Superman template of a level 2 warrior. It feels like when Superman first appeared, he wasn't that powerful until his abilities became increasingly perfect, so powerful that he could shatter a 6-dimensional universe with a single punch. Seeing the numerous Superman templates waiting to be unlocked in the consciousness space, Luke suddenly felt that one day he might be able to evolve to that level as well. A world without Batman and Kryptonite is truly wonderful. With these thoughts in mind, Luke closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep. Brooklyn, Old Joseph's Tavern. When Luke walked in, the people he was supposed to meet were already sitting in the corner. Timothy Alois Cadwallader Dugan. Good heavens! Your name is so long. I'll just call you Dum Dum Dugan. Luke waved for a dark beer, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He didn't engage in much small talk, nor did he try to appear overly enthusiastic. Dugan is a typical soldier, with rugged features and a mustache that curls upwards. Upon seeing his commander, who was an excessively young fellow, his expression darkened. Because on a battlefield fraught with danger, the word young often means lacking sufficient experience and having not fought in many battles. It also means that entrusting your back to such a person would be a terrible thing. Captain Cavill, you've been promoted pretty quickly. I heard you were just a private a month ago. Dugan sneered. In his opinion, Luke was definitely a rich kid who had climbed the social ladder by connections. Otherwise, how could a new recruit be promoted to lieutenant officer so quickly? Moreover, Dugan had not heard of any remarkable achievements or merits by the other side. Judging from his resume alone, it can be said to be a blank slate. I'd prefer you to call me sir. Luke smiled, showing no sign of anger. He turned to the other man sitting next to Dugan and said softly, Colonel Dynamanoli Philip,